Welcome to Candlelight Mysteries, a place where shadows whisper secrets and every flicker of the flame hides a tale untold. Tonight, beneath the glow of a single candle, we will journey into a story filled with suspense, secrets, and timeless intrigue. Before we begin, I'd love to know a little about you. Where are you listening from, and what drew you to the world of mysteries? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's build a circle of mystery lovers together. If you enjoy tonight's tale, don't forget to subscribe and join our growing Candlelight Mysteries family. Here, every flame carries a story, waiting just for you. Now let us step quietly into the darkness and begin Chapter 1, The Empty Cottage on Rose Lane. It began, as such things so often did in St. Mary Mead, with something so ordinary that no one but Miss Marple would have given it a second thought. Mrs. Dulcie Hartwell's cottage, prim, whitewashed, with green shutters and climbing roses, stood that Monday morning in the pale September sun, quite as usual. Quite, that is, except for the silence. The postman, trundling up the lane, paused at the little gate. "Funny thing," he muttered to himself, placing a small parcel on the step beside two untouched bottles of milk. "She's never one to sleep past 8. He rattled the latch once, shrugged, and went his way whistling. 10 minutes later, Miss Jane Marple came walking up the lane, her neat straw hat tied with blue ribbon, her market basket swinging lightly at her elbow. She was not, as she often insisted, the sort of person who pried. But, she would add, one does notice things. And that morning, she noticed plenty. The saucer of cream that usually stood by the doorstep had been filled, yesterday, by the look of it, but not a paw mark marred its surface. That was odd. Mrs. Hartwell's cat, Pudding, was an unrepentant glutton and would never have left such an offering untouched. The windows were closed, curtains half drawn, yet the garden gate, neat little latch and all, stood open to the lane. Miss Marple's eyes, bright as forget-me-nots, took in every small disorder. She bent to retrieve the parcel. The label, neatly written, announced, "Miss Dulcie Hartwell, Rose Cottage, knitting wool sky blue, 4 Oz." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured softly. "She ordered that last week. I heard her telling Mrs. Linton she'd begun a cardigan for the verger's niece. Most industrious of her." She replaced the parcel gently and looked again at the windows. There was no movement, not even the shifting of lace against glass. From inside the silence pressed outward, heavy and unnatural, as if the cottage itself held its breath. At the post office later that morning, Miss Marple mentioned, casually of course, that she had found Mrs. Hartwell's parcel still waiting at her door. "Dear me," said Miss Todd, the postmistress, "that's the 3rd day running she's not collected her letters. I thought she might be visiting her sister in Bath." "She didn't say so at church last Sunday," Miss Marple replied mildly, and Mrs. Hartwell was never one for sudden arrangements. "Perhaps she's unwell," offered Miss Todd, "though Dr. Nash hasn't been called there." "Unwell people," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "usually leave more signs than that. Outside, 2 old gentlemen were disputing about begonias, and a child's bicycle bell rang in the distance. Everything about St. Mary Mead looked utterly peaceful. Yet Miss Marple, tucking her knitting needles into her bag, felt the faintest tightening in the air, like the hush before a thunderclap. That afternoon, she stopped by Rose Lane again, ostensibly to deliver some cuttings of pink geranium. The garden smelled of damp earth and fading summer. The gloves Mrs. Hartwell had worn for pruning lay neatly on the window-sill, palms up, as if waiting for their owner to return. Dust gathered already along the cuffs. Through the glass, Miss Marple could just make out the sitting-room beyond, tidy, the armchair straight, the hearth swept. Only the calendar on the mantelpiece struck a wrong note, the page torn away neatly to Wednesday. Today, however, was Monday. "A small thing," Miss Marple murmured, "but a curious one." The gate creaked softly behind her. Turning, she saw Mr. Rook, the handyman, trundling his bicycle along. He touched his cap. "Morning, Miss Marple. Are you looking for Mrs. Hartwell?"
"I did hope to see her," Miss Marple replied pleasantly.
"She hasn't been about lately." "No, nor likely to be, I fancy."
"Heard she's gone off sudden. Family matters, so they say." "Oh? Who told you that?"
"Mrs. Linton, up at the Green, said she saw her leave with a small case early yesterday before breakfast." Miss Marple smiled. That was kind of Mrs. Linton to notice. "But then," she added, her tone light, "one does wonder who keeps house for the cat." Mr. Rook chuckled.
"That greedy beast?"
"It'll fend for itself." He mounted his bicycle and was gone before she could ask more. Inside, the silence of the cottage seemed to echo the man's words. Miss Marple's fingers brushed the doorknob as she considered whether to try it. She did not open the door. Such boldness was not her way. But she did notice something very particular. The brass handle bore a thin smear of potting soil, faint yet distinct, on its inner curve. Not from the lane side, but from within. Later, over tea with Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple recounted her little observations. "It may be nothing," she said, "but one so often finds that untidiness is the mark of the unexpected." Mrs. Bantry laughed. "My dear Jane, you see mystery in every unwashed cup." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Unwashed cups are very revealing, my dear. One can tell a good deal about the company a person keeps from the state of their saucers." That evening, as the sun sank over the thatched roofs, the first murmurs began to ripple through the village. Mrs. Hartwell's milk bottles had not been taken in again. The grocer had a small bill unpaid. Mrs. Linton mentioned, quite without meaning to, that she had seen a light moving in Mrs. Hartwell's parlour at nearly midnight 2 nights before, but thought no harm of it at the time.
"Perhaps she couldn't sleep," she said.
Perhaps she was writing letters. Miss Marple only nodded. She had already noted that there had been no letters sent. Next morning, curiosity became concern. The vicar called at Rose Cottage and, receiving no answer, fetched Mr. Rook to force the door. Miss Marple arrived soon after, her shawl wrapped tight against the morning chill. She stood quietly as the men peered inside.
Nothing was amiss, no struggle, no disarray, only an odd impression of absence, as if the air had been recently disturbed and then gone still again. The kitchen was spotless.
A kettle stood filled on the range, ready for boiling, but stone cold. A loaf of bread lay covered neatly by a cloth, one slice missing, and beside the sink a cup stood upside down to drain. An uncharacteristic economy for Mrs. Hartwell, who always left dishes to dry naturally. Miss Marple ran a finger along the rim. Damp, very slightly. "Looks like she just walked out," said Mr. Rook. "Indeed," Miss Marple replied. "But people seldom walk out without a coat, don't you find?" In the hall, her sharp eyes caught another inconsistency. The umbrella stand was empty, though Mrs. Hartwell owned a green one with a carved duck's head. "Perhaps taken for the journey," Miss Marple murmured to herself. Yet there was no journeying spirit about the cottage. No list left for the grocer, no note for the post, not even the half-finished knitting that should have lain on the chair arm. A faint scratch at the door made her look down. Pudding, the cat, had returned at last, mewing softly. He padded inside, sniffed the corners, and sat abruptly by the hearth, tail twitching. His fur bristled faintly as he stared toward the back door. Miss Marple's gaze followed. The garden beyond was a tumble of dahlias and overgrown mint. The soil near the lilac bush looked darker than the rest, freshly turned. Mr. Rook, following her glance, said with a grin, "Buried her bulbs early this year, eh?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "though I fancy Mrs. Hartwell never used her spade without gloves, and those, as we've seen, are still upon the window-sill." They left the cottage locked once more, the key kept by the vicar for safe-keeping. But, as Miss Marple walked back down Rose Lane, her knitting bag light against her arm, she could not shake the quiet certainty that something altogether out of the ordinary had occurred. It was not merely that Mrs. Hartwell was missing. It was that everything about her absence had been arranged to appear perfectly ordinary. And that, Miss Marple knew from long experience, was the surest sign of mischief beneath. The village would gossip, of course. It always did. They would speak of family visits, sudden inheritances and seaside cures. But Miss Marple, pausing at her gate and looking back toward the empty cottage, felt a chill more curious than fearful. Her eyes lingered on the distant gleam of a single window pane, catching the last light of day. She smiled, the gentle, knowing smile that puzzled even her dearest friends. For Miss Marple, wise in the ways of small human deceits, had seen too many tidy houses with one detail out of place. And she knew, though she would not yet say it aloud, that the quiet little disappearance of Mrs. Hartwell was not a holiday at all. And Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew she had just seen the first shadow of murder. It began with a remark no one meant to be unkind. "Some women," said Mrs. Petherick at the nursery counter, "buy more rose feed than roses." She glanced, not quite accidentally, toward the rack of invoices where Mr. Rook's name appeared beside a recently settled account. Settled, as the young clerk confided after a bit of a to-do with Mrs. Dulcie Hartwell. That was the hook Miss Marple needed. She had come, ostensibly, for delphinium steaks and onion sets. She remained for conversation. The High Street nursery smelled of damp peat and oiled metal, an odour Miss Marple found companionable. She stood with her purse clasped and her hat-pins very tidy, watching the faint fogging of the pane as the outside air met the greenhouse warmth. The junior clerk, cheeks pink from the hotbed, leaned in to whisper that Mrs. Hartwell had called Mr. Rook a creative gentleman over an invoice twice what she'd expected. "Not that I took sides," he added quickly, then looked relieved when Miss Marple only smiled and asked for the thinner twine. Her needles would want it later. Near the seed packets, two ladies plucked at envelopes of verbena and murmured about journeys. "A small case at dawn," one remarked, "and not a word to the postmistress." This was the sort of remark that drifted toward Miss Marple without effort. The village had learned over many years that she did not repeat things carelessly and that her expression, mild, courteous, faintly interested, was as safe as a locked drawer. Outside, the lane carried the sounds of a cart and the ticking of a cooling bicycle. Miss Marple stepped into the pale light and paused by the neat line of nursery barrows. It was then her attention sharpened on something domestic and concrete, just beyond the nursery gate, where the lane crossed toward Rose Cottage. Bicycle tire marks stitched a narrow pattern into the softer verge, not the thick tread of Mr. Rook's old machine. Something slimmer, newer, the sort of wheel a careful girl might keep polished. The marks ran toward the back path that led beneath Mrs. Hartwell's lilac and went no farther, as if the rider had dismounted there. Miss Marple, half humming, traced the shallow crescents with the tip of her walking stick, and then walked on. The post office wore its usual Monday face, a brass bell with an aged ring, perforated blotters, and the calm, unquestioning patience of Miss Todd behind the counter. Beatrice Collins stood on the customer side, arranging postcards of St. Mary Mead Church and the Duck Pond with a devotion one did not always see in stationers' assistants. She looked, Miss Marple decided, more careful than clever and more eager than she realized. "Such a rush this morning," Beatrice said, not to anyone in particular, and then to Miss Marple with gratitude. "Would you believe 2 letters I carried to Mrs. Hartwell last week? One from Simmons and Pike, solicitors, very discreet, and the other scented." She coloured a fraction.
"I don't ordinarily notice such things. Few of us do," said Miss Marple gently, "except when the scent is unusual."
"Violets, perhaps?" Beatrice brightened, as if she'd passed a small test she hadn't known she was taking.
"Yes, not too sweet."
"From the chemist's window brand, I think. It clings." She spoke the last word softly, as though it had clung to her fingers. A tone shifted then, small but real. Beatrice's voice, so brisk a moment before, slowed when Miss Todd approached. The girl repositioned a calendar so precisely that the care felt like concealment. Miss Marple, watching without looking, timed the little pause that followed. A person who remembered 2 letters and their perfume also remembered where they were posted. A person who had repeated the story twice already wanted it to be useful.
And safe. Dear me, Miss Marple said with a mild flutter.
I shall be noted for causing delays, and she moved on with a package of green writing paper she didn't require. Small conversation, properly placed, asked all the questions needed. She stopped on Rose Lane with her market basket tucked firmly against her ribs and surveyed what the village had contrived to ignore. The spare key hook by the back door of Rose Cottage, polished brass, delicately shaped as a leaf, had a clean outline in the dust where a key had hung until very lately. Mrs. Hartwell was a woman of order. She did not, Miss Marple knew, leave keys lying about. Someone had taken it with care or replaced it carelessly. The difference mattered. Just then, a gentle voice drifted over the fence like the steam from a kettle. "Is that you, Miss Marple?" Mrs. Linton, cheeks fresh with cold, stood with a basket of laundry on her hip. Dreadful business about poor Dulcie simply disappearing like soup on a Sunday. "How quickly gossip boils," Miss Marple returned, with a pleasant nod. "You visited her last week, I think?" "Well, only to ask about bunting. Those young volunteers mislaid the red length again." Mrs. Linton's hands toyed with a clothespin. It clicked twice, a fast little sound. She seemed perfectly herself.
I always said Dulcie was...
Well, a little too friendly with the vicarage helpers, counting money as if it were recipes. "Counting is an art," Miss Marple agreed.
Like knitting.
"One drops a stitch and the pattern wanders off." Mrs. Linton laughed, but it didn't quite reach her eyes.
A second tone shift, a shade too hearty now.
She mentioned, between us girls, that Mr. Rook had been prickly about payment, then glanced toward the garden of Rose Cottage, in a way that suggested she hoped to see nothing. Miss Marple's needles would have clicked then.
Had they been in her hands?
Instead, her mind counted silently. Beatrice, eager, scented letters, the solicitor's crest. Mr. Rook, prickly, the bill, creative. Mrs. Linton, tone brighter than truth, volunteers and sums, and the spare key hook, so bare. A cat skittered across the path and darted under the lilac. Miss Marple followed at the angle of a person merely appreciating flowers. The hedge was clipped, though only recently. Something pale caught on a twig, a torn corner of a blue envelope, the sort solicitors favour, with the faintest breath of violet clinging to it as if the paper had slept in a scented drawer. Miss Marple lifted it carefully in her gloved fingers and let the breeze do the rest. It would not serve to brandish it yet. Better to let it be seen when people felt safest. She spent the next hour visiting 2 shops and a friend, and each provided a new thread. At the draper's, someone confided that Beatrice had bought a blotter pad, and curiously, a better pen than she was accustomed to. At the chemist's, Dr. Nash's assistant said, "We've sold a little more cologne these days. Violet, yes, and the envelope scenting oil. Some ladies like a whisper on their letters." The boy tried to sound knowing.
He sounded young.
Miss Marple thanked him as though he'd told her about the weather. By the time she reached the green, the afternoon had grown pale and cool. She found Mrs. Linton there again, speaking softly to Mrs. Bantry in the manner of a woman sharing a burden. "It's the petty thefts that annoy me," she was saying. "Fate money wandering as if it had feet. Such a tiny amount one hates to raise a fuss." She saw Miss Marple approach and brightened too quickly. "Oh, Miss Marple, you'll agree with me. Some people are careless with coins." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, "though in my experience coins are most careless when people are hoping they'll be." Her gaze drifted to Mrs. Linton's gloves. A smudge of peat stained the side of one forefinger, the precise mark a person might acquire from adjusting a flower pot in a hurry. Mrs. Linton noticed the glance, removed the glove, and laughed as if forgetting she'd been gardening at all. Another tone change, light, then lighter still. Near the tea shop, Miss Marple paused to watch the reflection of the high street flicker along the curved glass, a pastime she allowed herself when thinking hard. In quiet reflections, people believed themselves unobserved. They showed their true way of walking and their true speed. Beatrice passed with a bundle of envelopes clutched against her chest, walking half a beat too fast for a girl with no urgent task. When Miss Marple greeted her, Beatrice slowed, adopted an air of leisure, and then, very slightly, tilted the top envelope to hide the printed crest of Simmons and Pike. "A pleasure to see young people busy," Miss Marple said.
"So helpful to the village?" "Oh, yes," Beatrice replied. "I've only errands, nothing."
Special. "Special things are often very small," Miss Marple murmured. She went next to Rose's cottage and stood for a time by the back door, as though wondering if a geranium would suit the step. The doorknob within, she remembered, had held a whisper of potting soil yesterday. The smear was gone now, polished away, but not by Mrs. Hartwell's favourite cloth, which would have left a faint lint thread at the screw seam. The Polish, a different brand, had a lemon edge. Mrs. Linton used such a polish. Miss Marple had once accepted a jar lid's worth to shine her candlesticks and remembered the scent. The day waned. Village life collected itself. Closing time, milk to set, coal scuttles filled. Miss Marple made a last brief call at the stationer's, where Beatrice, behind the counter, was addressing a stack of envelopes with meticulous care. The loops of capital letters had improved. There were practice sheets, firm strokes, then firmer still, tucked untidily beneath the blotter. When a customer entered, Beatrice's pen paused at the exact syllable of a surname that might have been Simmons, and did not, at the last moment, become so. Miss Marple asked for a reel of blue ribbon, and, while Beatrice searched, glanced at the ink-stained rag.
"Violet clung there too. A useful shade," Miss Marple said in quiet admiration.
"It hides the paler smears." Beatrice's eyes darted up. "Paler? Oh, you mean from fountain pens?" She swallowed, found the ribbon, and wrapped it with unnecessary care. Her tone had cooled a degree, as though some part of her felt suddenly inspected. At home, Miss Marple set down her basket and made tea. She did not knit.
Instead, she read the village evening, its footsteps and door latches, and the way a cat will leap where attention has recently been given.
Pudding, not her cat, but everyone's, wove himself about her ankles, and then trotted to the hearth-rug, paused, and stared toward the back step, as if expecting someone to come through it. Miss Marple lifted her cup and allowed herself a tiny nod. She had enough for a pattern now, a quarrel over money, a scented letter, a solicitor's crest copied by a careful hand, a missing key, a hedge that had eaten a corner of blue paper, and a Polish that did not belong to the lady who was missing. None of these proved anything. Together they hummed. When the clock chimed 8, she wrapped a shawl about her shoulders and stepped onto her little garden path. The air held a thin mist and the faintest trace of violets, absurdly out of season. She walked as far as her gate and stood with her hands folded, as though waiting for the night to settle. In the quiet, she could hear the nursery bell ring once as Mr. Rook locked up, and a bicycle bell far off, light, precise, the sort of bell that belongs to a careful girl who wished to be home before questions began. Miss Marple smiled into the dusk, that small, polite smile that reassured neighbours and worried those who had something on their conscience. "Oh, my dear village," she thought.
How you wrap secrets in lace and call it good manners." And Miss Marple, smiling kindly,
knew she had just seen the first shadow of something dark. Here's your full-length, Chapter 3, expanded in the cosy Christie-style narration, about 1,100 words, ready for audiobook pacing and tone. The meeting of the St. Mary Mead, Women's Institute began, as such gatherings usually did, with a faint clatter of teacups and an air of cheerful chaos. The hall smelled faintly of lemon sponge, floor polish, and the lingering starch of freshly ironed linens. Outside, rain tapped lightly on the windows. Though no one seemed to notice, it was, after all, a good day for a bit of fellowship, as Mrs. Linton declared brightly. It was Mrs. Linton who poured the tea, her smile just a shade too wide, her hands trembling slightly as she tilted the spout of the teapot. Miss Marple, seated near the end of the table with her knitting discreetly tucked away, watched the gesture with mild interest. The teapot itself was not the Institute's usual china. This one had a small chip on its spout and a faded rose pattern, the sort that belonged in a private kitchen rather than the church hall. "New teapot, dear?" Miss Marple asked, her tones so pleasant that no one could possibly suspect she had already drawn a quiet conclusion. "Oh, yes," Mrs. Linton said quickly, setting the pot down a little too sharply. "The regular one cracked last week. This is just a spare." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to the small white mark where glaze had broken away. She remembered seeing that same teapot once before, on Mrs. Linton's dresser during a parish tea. A little domestic borrowing was nothing unusual in St. Mary Mead, but it was the timing that interested her. A few minutes later, as plates of sponge cake circulated, someone remarked that rosemary could upset certain stomachs. Mrs. Bantry, who had never met an herb she didn't defend, countered that it was wonderful for memory. "Not always pleasant ones," murmured Mrs. Linton, in a tone that changed the air for just a moment. Miss Marple's gaze drifted, quite idly, to Mrs. Linton's reticule, left open beside her chair. From its pocket peeked two small seed packets, rosemary and valerian, curious companions, one for remembrance, one for sleep. Gossip fluttered next, as it always did, when the tea reached its second pouring.
"Colonel Stukely has been making rounds again," Mrs. Petherick whispered to her neighbour.
"Popping in on all the widows with tidy annuities." There was a little ripple of laughter. "He must think himself quite the comfort." "Oh, he's charming enough," said Mrs. Bantry. "But one should never confuse charm with character. They seldom occupy the same drawing-room." Miss Marple smiled behind her cup. The conversation rolled on as gossip does, half true and wholly revealing. Dr. Nash's new assistant, it seemed, had been ordering more tonic than any healthy household could possibly need, which everyone found most concerning. Miss Marple's interest pricked up slightly at that. Tonics, like herbs, had their stories if one cared to read the labels closely. Through it all, Mrs. Linton seemed unusually talkative. Her laughter came too readily, her remarks too polished, as though she were performing the role of sociable hostess rather than living it. Each time someone mentioned Mrs. Hartwell's disappearance, she had a ready phrase, sympathetic, brisk, and curiously detached. "I always said Dulcie kept too much to herself," she repeated, pouring tea from the borrowed pot. "A woman should never be secretive. It leads to misunderstandings." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed softly, "and sometimes to discoveries." When the lemon sponge was half eaten and conversation began to lull, Miss Marple excused herself to see about the washing up. She slipped into the scullery where a row of clean cups steamed gently beside a damp towel. The air was warm and sweet from the sponge, but beneath it hung another scent, faint, elusive, and entirely out of place.
Violet cologne.
Not the kind the vicar's wife wore, but that same distinctive fragrance Miss Marple had noticed once before, clinging to a torn blue envelope near Rose Lane. She touched the towel lightly. The scent was strongest there, and old enough that it had not come from a recent spill. Someone had wiped something clean, a small object perhaps, or a hand that needed to be freshened quickly. The sort of small, nervous act that never escaped Miss Marple's attention. From the hall came the sound of chairs scraping a hymn beginning for the close of meeting. She straightened a stack of plates, her eyes landing on a folded hymn leaflet left beside the sink. The paper was marked, not with hymn numbers, as one would expect, but with faint pencil figures, additions and subtractions, the kind of sums one made when dividing money. Fed proceeds, perhaps, or something that ought not to have been divided at all. She turned the leaflet over in her hand. A small slip of paper fluttered free and landed at her feet. Miss Marple bent. Her knees were not as nimble as they once were, but her curiosity made up for it, and lifted it. A pawn ticket, old and creased, folded as carefully as one folds a prayer. The item listed was brief and curiously nondescript. Gold locket, oval. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the words for a long moment. Pawn tickets, like recipes, always told a story, and this one, she suspected, belonged to a tale still half hidden. She slipped the paper back into the leaflet and returned to the hall, where the women were singing All Things Bright and Beautiful, in a key that did neither the hymn nor the singers much justice. Mrs. Linton was tidying plates, her laughter a touch too shrill now, and when Miss Marple approached, she started slightly, her hand knocking against a teacup. It tipped but didn't fall, only wobbled in place before she steadied it. "Dear me, nerves?" Miss Marple asked, all gentle concern. "Oh, just a long day," Mrs. Linton said, and smiled too quickly. "The Fate Committee has been dreadful lately. Accounts, you know." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Accounts have a way of keeping one awake at night." Mrs. Linton blinked, uncertain whether to laugh. Her mouth began to shape a reply, but failed to find one before Miss Marple turned toward the coat rack. She never hurried her exits. She knew how a well-timed silence could invite more reflection than 100 questions. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the village air damp and faintly metallic. Miss Marple walked home through puddles reflecting gaslight and memory alike. She thought of the seed packets, the pairing of rosemary and valerian, of Mrs. Linton's trembling hands, the borrowed teapot, and the faint violet scent where it had no reason to be, of the sums penciled on a hymn leaflet and the pawn ticket folded like a prayer. At her cottage, she set down her umbrella and, before lighting the lamp, paused to glance toward the mantelpiece where her small clock ticked evenly. The sound comforted her. It was the sound of a mind keeping time with the world's small oddities. She filled her kettle, placed it on the hob, and, while waiting for it to boil, unfolded a fresh page in her notebook. She did not write much, only a few small observations. Teapot, borrowed, chipped. Rosemary and valerian, contradictory pairing. Violet scent, persistent. Pawn ticket, gold locket.
Linton too calm, too careful. Then with a faint smile,
she underlined one phrase, a teapot out of place. For Miss Marple had learned long ago that in a tidy village, disorder often began with something perfectly harmless, a cup, a scent, a seed packet, and ended with something that could never be put right again. She poured herself tea,
adding a single cube of sugar, and sat down by the fire.
Outside, the wind stirred the hollyhocks, and somewhere down the lane a cat yowled at the moon. "Strange," she murmured, "how people think secrets can be contained in small things." Her eyes went to the pawn ticket lying on the table. The words "gold locket," "oval," gleaming faintly in the lamplight. Miss Marple leaned back, her knitting resting loosely in her lap. She had no proof yet, only a collection of moments and scents and tremors, but she knew from experience that truth, like tea, reveals its strength when allowed to steep, and Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew she had just seen the first shadow of murder. Chapter 4. The Vicarage Ledger. It was the sort of invitation Miss Marple never refused, not because she liked numbers, but because she liked what numbers revealed about people. Reverend Pritchard had sent a note written in his own tremulous hand, requesting her aid in ensuring accuracy as he and Mrs. Pritchard balanced the parish fete accounts. "Just a few shillings unaccounted for," he'd written, "and I'd be most grateful for your oversight." So on that bright Thursday morning, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage, her shawl pinned close and her mind as tidy as her basket of knitting. The vicarage garden lay fragrant with late roses, though the grass near the lilac path was pressed with the faint marks of heavy boots. Miss Marple noticed that before she even knocked. Mrs. Pritchard herself opened the door, brisk as ever, and powdered with flour from her morning's baking. "So kind of you to come, Miss Marple."
My husband will be so relieved to have another set of eyes on the books.
"It's only a trifle, of course, but he does hate things not balancing." "Quite right," said Miss Marple kindly. "There's nothing more unsettling than an uneven ledger. Rather like a picture hung askew, it throws the whole room off balance." Inside, the study smelled of polished oak and old hymnals. A kettle steamed faintly on the hearth. Miss Marple noted the cup beside it, used and hastily rinsed. Tea, not coffee, with a faint trace of valerian. The Reverend himself rose from behind a desk, cluttered with papers, ink pots, and the very ledger in question, a thick brown book with its corners softened by time. "My dear Miss Marple," he exclaimed, rather too heartily for a man worried about arithmetic, "we simply need another mind to look through this small muddle. My wife has been most diligent, but there's a trifling matter of a missing sixpence, too. Perhaps that has proved elusive." Mrs. Pritchard, smoothing her apron, added quickly, "A mere formality, of course." Her tone carried just enough emphasis on mere to sound defensive. Miss Marple seated herself at the table, spectacles perched on her nose. "Sixpence, my dear Reverend, may seem a trifle, but it is quite astonishing how much mischief in this world begins with trifles." The vicar chuckled uncertainly and handed her the ledger. The columns ran neat enough, collections, expenses, donations, each signed off in Mrs. Pritchard's brisk, forward-slanting hand. All seemed in order until Miss Marple's eye caught a small annotation, written in an entirely different style, a rounded, delicate hand, the sort that took pride in spacing. It appeared beside an entry marked Miscellaneous 146D. "Who made this notation?" Miss Marple asked lightly. "Oh, that?" The Reverend peered over his spectacles. "That's Mrs. Hartwell's writing. She assisted us occasionally with parish sums. A wonderful head for figures."
"So unfortunate she's been away." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured.
"And when precisely did she last help?" Mrs. Pritchard answered this time, too quickly. "Last Thursday. She dropped in after luncheon. We finalized the fate accounts then." Miss Marple traced the figures with her finger. The ink had not faded. It gleamed faintly fresh within the week. She also noticed a faint smudge on the lower margin. Soil or something very like it. Was Mrs. Hartwell in the garden before she came in? "Possibly," said Mrs. Pritchard, frowning. "She used the side gate by the lilac hedge. I was arranging flowers at the time." "Ah, yes," Miss Marple said softly. "The lilac hedge." Her knitting fingers twitched at the memory of the same soil beneath it in Rose Lane. They went on through the accounts, Mrs. Pritchard explaining each expense in her efficient way. Yet Miss Marple noted that whenever a certain line appeared, charity raffle, donations, cash, or miscellaneous, Hartwell, Mrs. Pritchard's voice changed. She spoke more quickly, with the bright tone of someone eager to move forward. At one point, the Reverend mentioned, "Mrs. Hartwell was a generous soul, you know. Quietly lent small sums here and there, never wanted it spoken of." "How very kind," Miss Marple said. "I dare say some might have felt quite grateful." She looked up just in time to see Mrs. Pritchard's knitting needles still mid-air, paused an instant before resuming their rhythm. A small change, but the kind Miss Marple never missed. The vicar rose to fetch another pot of tea, leaving Miss Marple and his wife alone. Mrs. Pritchard filled the silence briskly. It's all quite tedious, of course. My husband's too trusting. He'd let anyone sign the books if they brought a smile and a sponge cake. Goodness, Miss Marple murmured. How fortunate he has you, then. You seem to know exactly where everything belongs. Mrs. Pritchard's lips tightened into a polite smile. One must in parish life. Disorder is so unbecoming. A faint tap at the window made them both glance up. It was only Mr. Rook passing the vicarage gate, pushing his bicycle. His boots were caked with garden earth, though the morning had been dry. Miss Marple watched his progress until he turned the corner toward Rose Lane. "Does Mr. Rook often visit here?" she asked. "Oh, yes," Mrs. Pritchard replied. "He mends the shed roof and helps with the churchyard. Occasionally he cuts through from Rose Lane to save time." Miss Marple smiled faintly.
"Ah, that shortcut again."
"So very convenient for some." When the Reverend returned, she examined the remaining pages. Near the end of the ledger, tucked neatly among folded correspondence, she found a thin slip of paper, an official note from a firm of solicitors, Simmons and Pike. It referenced a change in the beneficiary of a modest annuity, signed in careful script, Dulcie Hartwell, witnessed Thursday last. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the signature. It was small, cramped, written by a hand that had trembled or hesitated. "How curious," she said softly, "that such important matters should be settled on the same day as fate accounts." The Reverend blinked. "Indeed? Oh, that's just a coincidence, I'm sure." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly, but her voice held the tone of someone who found coincidences remarkably rare in St. Mary Mead. As they concluded their audit, the Reverend seemed relieved. "You see, nothing truly amiss, just a few figures misplaced." Miss Marple smiled. "Numbers are obedient things, Reverend."
They go wherever one puts them. It's people who are more unruly. They all laughed politely, yet beneath the laughter hung the faint tension of unspoken worry.
When she took her leave, Mrs. Pritchard insisted on walking her to the garden gate. "Such a help you've been," Mrs. Pritchard said. "I'm certain we'll find those missing coins soon." Miss Marple looked down the path, where the lilac hedge cast soft shadows on the earth.
"I do hope so," she said.
"For sometimes it isn't the coin that's lost, but what went missing with it." Mrs. Pritchard frowned, clearly puzzled, but Miss Marple's expression remained serenely unreadable. She reached out to adjust her glove, and as she did, she noticed something on the latch of the side gate, a faint smear of dried soil, the same reddish-brown hue as that found inside Rose Cottage. Someone had passed through recently, with haste and unwashed hands. As she walked home, Miss Marple's thoughts arranged themselves as neatly as stitches on her needles.
A smudge of soil in the vestry, a faint trace of valerian in the Reverend's cup,
A solicitor's letter about a changed will, and a woman, Mrs. Pritchard, who had too much energy to be as calm as she appeared. At her own gate, she paused and looked back toward the vicarage. The church bell tolled faintly in the distance, one deep note rolling across the fields. Miss Marple smiled to herself, though her eyes remained grave. "Fate money, annuities, wills," she murmured. "Such very dull things until one remembers that dull things are what people kill for." The evening wind lifted her scarf lightly, carrying with it the faint perfume of lilac and the suggestion of something hidden beneath it. And Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew she had just seen the first shadow of murder. Chapter 5. Lace curtains and late trains. In the It began with a hushed aside in the station tea-room, the sort of remark that slides across a saucer like steam and disappears if one doesn't listen. "Stopped for a signal at 11:10, said the woman behind the counter, her voice doing its best to sound uninterested. Odd time for a halt, if you ask me. I saw a lace scarf on the platform, fluttering like it had a mind of its own. She wiped a cup with that special care people reserve for the cups used by those they talk about. Miss Marple, who had come ostensibly for a small pot of tea and a currant bun, looked up with polite surprise and the faintest crinkle of pleasure at the corners of her eyes. She always liked a timetable. Trains, like knitting patterns and ledgers, separated the fanciful from the possible. The station tea-room had an agreeable smell of boiled kettle and clean wood. A row of railway posters, seaside promises in faded blues, hung slightly askew, and a clock that had once been punctual now lost 2 minutes an hour with dignified reluctance. Miss Marple's needles rested in her bag. She preferred to keep her hands free when time itself was being discussed. She asked, in her mild way, whether late halts were common. "Not common, ma'am," said the counterwoman, who responded to courtesy as flowers do to sun. "But there is that little stopping service, slips in and out with hardly a whistle. The last one at night doesn't announce itself. Suits folk who don't like being seen." A man at the next table, the guard, by his cap and the stiff way he set it down, cleared his throat. "I had a passenger ask me the other night," he said, "whether the late quiet ran on time." "Quiet," she called it. He paused, reseated his cap, then added,
Not many ladies know the difference between the fast and the little local unless they've been told. His tone shifted there.
a half-inch of roughness under the official polish. Miss Marple heard it, filed it, and sipped. Gossip travels in pairs like sparrows, and the second sparrow hopped down a moment later. "They say Mr. Rook was here 2 nights back," the counterwoman ventured, dropping her voice. Wheeling a crate as if it owed him money, grumbled something about charity beginning at home, which I didn't admire. He's strong as 2 men when he chooses to be. She slid Miss Marple the bun with a conspiratorial nod, as though currents improved with scandal. Miss Marple thanked her, and, on her way out, allowed her steps to wander toward the far end of the platform, where the wind gathered in a small gust around the notice board. The wastebin there had not been emptied. On top lay a travel advertisement, clipped with care from a magazine. Trunks with brass corners, the sort that look secure rather than are. Folded inside it like a thought tucked away, lay a ticket stub. Brackstone, 3rd class, 1 way. Brackstone was the next village, close enough for a walk on a sunny morning, yet just far enough to be another place altogether on a foggy night. She turned the stub between gloved fingers. The edge bore a smudge of something that wasn't ink. Polish, perhaps, the kind used on wooden counters or leather handles. One doesn't pick up polish from a ticket office unless one leans too far or hurries one's hands. Miss Marple put the stub back exactly as she found it and thought, not for the first time, how often the first step of a vanishing is taken with the most ordinary heel. Outside on the platform, the porter was chalking a board with unconvincing confidence. He had a nice way with chalk, all careful loops and a worried look whenever he spelled anything with more than 2 syllables. Miss Marple asked how his rheumatism was and whether his niece had taken to the new spectacles. He warmed at once, as people do when asked about their small lives rather than their opinions. "Better, thank you kindly. A bit of rain in the bones. Now if only certain folk didn't bring heavy crates at closing." He winced at the memory or the weight. It was difficult to say which. "Mr. Rook had me hold a door while he trundled the thing. Said it was tools. Tools don't rattle like china, though, do they?" "Not usually," Miss Marple agreed, "unless the tools were for a very particular craft." The porter blinked at that, and, as sometimes happens when an old woman says something that sounds like a parable, decided it was both wise and unhelpful. He came round to the safer ground of trains. There's the 11:10 halt some nights, between signals, when everything's meant to be quiet. I don't advertise it. He said this with the cautious pride of a man entrusted with a small secret. His tone softened again, and Miss Marple thought how tone, not words, betrayed our truest feelings. The porter disliked late arrivals, and disliked even more the idea that he might be part of someone else's arrangement. Back through the tea room she went, taking with her the tea's warmth and the bun's good manners. At the door, a girl whisked past, the stationer's assistant, Beatrice, cheeks pink as if from running or thinking too fast. She glanced at the clock as a person does who has either just avoided being late or is about to declare it wasn't her fault. Miss Marple greeted her, and Beatrice replied with a sweetness that lacked its usual eagerness.
A change in tempo.
A chord minor instead of major. The girl carried a small parcel tied with string. String from the stationer's. Yes, but the knot was a porter's knot, neat and tight and meant to be lifted, not admired. The sky outside the station had turned the particular grey that makes lamp glass look golden. Miss Marple walked the gentle slope back toward the high street. At Mrs. Linton's end of the green, lace curtains stirred as if at a sudden breeze, though the evening air lay still as a folded shawl. Curtains do not move unless a hand is near, or a window is nudged, or a watcher forgets caution. Miss Marple did not look up directly. She paused instead to rescue a fallen sprig of geranium from the pavement, and in that humble posture saw the curtain settle again with the quick shame of a child who has laughed in church. A voice hailed her then, Colonel Stukely, briskly conversational, smelling faintly of bay rum and opinions. "Evening, Miss Marple."
Nasty business, all this talk.
"If you ask me, too much license for post-war trains, little unscheduled halts and such. Not proper." He tapped his stick in a martinet rhythm. "One can always tell a forged hand, by the way. Saw dozens in my time. A person who has nothing to hide writes big. Remember that?" He offered the last in the tone of an expert handing over a rule. Miss Marple thanked him, and did not mention that small hands often write small for reasons that have nothing to do with guilt. The Colonel's advice slid into her general store of village maxims, where it could jostle with sense and nonsense until the useful bits rose to the top. Near Rose Lane, the air carried a faint scent of damp earth. The garden at Rose Cottage looked respectable by moonlight, the way some rooms do when lamplight forgives what daylight would scold. Miss Marple let herself pause at the gate as though thinking of nothing at all. Putting the cat materialize, she did not move the stone. Miss Marple seldom disturbed things. She preferred to read them as they lay. But she noticed, as any good reader would, the punctuation marks, a tiny crescent of scraped earth against the stone's far side, a crumb of reddish grit on the near side, a shallow indention in the soil, oval, not round, as though a travelling case-foot had rested there for a moment. She drew back her gloved hand and smoothed the disturbed edge of soil with the same maternal touch she might use to settle a child's collar. There came, from somewhere not far, the small clink of a latch lifted and dropped too quickly. Miss Marple's head turned, not sharply, merely with interest.
A figure moved behind Mrs. Linton's hedge, too slight for Mr. Rook, too sure-footed for the vicar, and with the quick, brisk step of a woman who tidies things that are none of her business.
Miss Marple did not call out. She stood very still and allowed the evening to finish its sentence. After a breath or two, the lace curtain at Mrs. Linton's twitched once more and was still. She went home by the longer path, which gives the mind more time to sort. Along the way she passed the telegraph pole where a notice flapped, "Bring and buy. Trunks, cases, household sundries." It had been pasted at a careless angle. One corner had torn and mended itself with dust. Or not dust, polish, the same faint lemon edge she had caught on the ticket stub. She thought of the crate that rattled like china, the tools that protested their identity, the late halt that doesn't announce itself, and the lace scarf the counterwoman had mentioned, moth-wing light under a station lamp. At her own gate, Miss Marple paused, listening to the small, companionable noises of a village settling, coal in a scuttle. A child told kindly to bed. A kettle moved closer to the flame. She put the key in her door and stopped. Her fingers had remembered something her brain had not yet put into words. Keys. Spare keys. Hooks left bare. She felt, not doubt, but the prickle that comes before clarity, the way a stitch feels when one suspects it has been dropped 6 rows back. Inside, she made tea and did not drink it at once. She set the cup near the window where the steam showed briefly against the last of the light, and she watched the lane. Her expression was as amiable as ever. Only the stillness of her hands betrayed how closely she observed. People think a mind must frown to be sharp. Miss Marple's never did. It would have wrinkled her kindness. She considered what could be done with a late train that stops without speaking, what one might place inside a crate that pretends to be tools and yet protests with China's little rattle, what a person might think when lace catches on hedge thorns. Not panic, not if she is practiced, but a smooth, ready movement to free it before anyone sees. She thought of Braxton, near enough to matter, far enough to be useful, and of a locket pledged, a will amended, small sums that travel with soft feet, and a curtain that flutters when the wind has already gone to bed. When the clock chimed 9, she rose, set her untouched tea back on the hob, and laid out her knitting. The pattern was simple, little diamonds that repeated and repeated, and it had only the virtue she required from patterns. It told her when she had gone wrong. 2 stitches in, she smiled, the smile that makes neighbours confide and guilty hearts over-explain. For Miss Marple saw, as clearly as if it had been written in the station's ledger, that someone in St. Mary Mead had learned to travel quietly, to tidy quickly, and to pretend that ordinary things, curtains, stones, crates, scarves, did not speak. But they did speak. They always do to the right listener. She set down her needles without looking at them, and allowed the room to grow comfortably dim. Outside the wind did not return, and yet somewhere a strip of lace shifted as if in restless sleep. Miss Marple's eyes went to the dark shape of the lilac in her mind, rather than her window, and she thought of the single new stone among the old ones. And Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew she had just seen the first shadow of murder. Chapter 6. The Cat That Wouldn't Eat. It began, as curious things often do, with a cat who refused his supper. Tiggy, the undisputed gourmand of St. Mary Mead, a creature who had sampled every saucer,
doorstep, and window-sill in the village, sat before Mrs. Linton's hearth with an expression that could only be called affronted.
A dish of kippers lay untouched, though their smell filled the air in robust competition with the scent of polish and rose potpourri. "My word, Tiggy, are you turning temperamental?" Mrs. Linton said, bending down to coax him. "Anyone would think you'd been dining elsewhere." Miss Marple, seated primly near the window with her knitting bag at her feet, observed the scene with mild curiosity.
"Cats," she said softly, "are much like people."
They know when something doesn't quite agree with them, though they seldom say why. Tiggy gave a sniff of disdain and wandered instead toward the pantry, tail high, pausing before a sealed brown bottle that stood beside the flour jar. He sat purring, a low, almost deliberate sound. "What an odd fancy," murmured Miss Marple. "He's found himself a different kind of flavour." Mrs. Linton followed his gaze. "Oh, that," she said too quickly, picking up the bottle. "Restorative drops. Dr. Nash's assistant recommended them."
"My nerves, you know." "That's nothing important." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles.
The label, written in tidy black letters, read, "Restorative drops, 1 teaspoon at dusk." A small instruction beneath noted, "Shake well before use." "Keep out of sunlight. A sensible precaution," Miss Marple remarked mildly. "Sunlight can alter the character of many things, even people," Mrs. Linton laughed, a touch too brightly. "You do have a turn of phrase, Miss Marple." She tucked the bottle back into the pantry and closed the door firmly. That laugh, Miss Marple thought, was the sound of a person hoping to end a subject rather than enjoy it. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call to the chemist's shop, where rows of glass jars caught the light like jewels. The young assistant behind the counter, eager to be useful, greeted her with a smile that betrayed more enthusiasm than discretion. "I was hoping," Miss Marple began in her gentle voice, "for something to help my roses. They do droop so dreadfully in the evenings." Then, almost as an afterthought, she glanced at the shelf of tinctures. Those restorative drops seem quite popular lately. "They must be most effective," the boy brightened, flattered to be asked.
"Oh, yes, madam.
"Though I always warn people they're not meant for regular use. Heavy with valerian and a trace of something to hush the nerves. Dr. Nash says it should be taken sparingly." "Quite right," Miss Marple nodded. "Too much peace can be as troublesome as too little." The boy leaned forward conspiratorially. "Funny thing, though, 2 of our ladies have been taking it rather often."
Paid in coin, both of them. Mrs. Linton and Miss Beatrice Collins from the stationers. Nice young girl, that one, but always asking for scented paper." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled.
"Indeed, scented paper is such a luxury. But perhaps some letters deserve perfume more than ink." As she turned to go, the boy added, "If you'd like, I can set aside a bottle for you, madam." "Oh, I shouldn't think so," she said. "My nerves are quite robust, thank you. It's my curiosity that sometimes keeps me awake." That same curiosity led her next to the stationer's. Beatrice Collins was in the back room, busily addressing envelopes with the care of someone copying a lesson. The faint scent of violets hung in the air, subtle but unmistakable. "Good afternoon, my dear," Miss Marple said, smiling as she pretended to admire the tidy stacks of paper. "Such beautiful loops you make."
"You must have been practicing." Beatrice blushed, covering a sheet quickly with another.
"Oh, it's nothing, just a bit of handwriting practice. I'd like it to look as fine as a solicitor's, you know."
"Of course," Miss Marple said pleasantly, though her gaze caught the corner of the page.
The curls and capitals were not imitations of beauty, they were copies of precision. Someone had been rehearsing another person's hand. A blotter lay nearby, faintly stained with violet ink and the trace of perfume. It wasn't difficult to imagine letters written with it, sealed with care, and delivered with trembling hands. Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the small waste bin. There, half crumpled, lay a discarded envelope bearing the ghost of a solicitor's crest at its corner. Beatrice followed her gaze and spoke too quickly. "That one was spoiled."
I copied it for fun. I like how tidy legal writing is." Miss Marple's smile did not falter. "I quite understand."
"There's something very satisfying about neat work. Though imitation, my dear, is a dangerous form of admiration." Beatrice laughed uncertainly, her hand brushing a bottle of violet scent off the desk. She caught it mid-air, barely. "Oh!" "Clumsy me. Not at all," Miss Marple said softly. "We all drop things when startled." By evening, Miss Marple had collected enough small curiosities to justify a call upon Mr. Rook, the handyman. He was in his shed, sharpening tools with the solemn patience of a man who enjoys talking if someone else begins. "Good evening, Mr. Rook," Miss Marple said. "I came across a curious thing in the church accounts, the matter of your recent work at Mrs. Hartwell's cottage."
"I wonder, did she settle your payment before she left?"
Mr. Rook frowned, set down his file and rubbed his hands on a rag that looked as though it hadn't been truly clean in years. "Took what was owed to me, miss. She'd been slow to pay, and I've mouths to feed, same as anyone." "Quite right," Miss Marple said approvingly. "A fair day's wage for a fair day's work. You had a written invoice, I suppose?" He brightened, clearly pleased to appear respectable, and produced one from his pocket. It was curiously pristine, smooth, unsmudged, and free of dirt for a man who worked with spades and soil. The ink shone new, most businesslike, Miss Marple said, glancing at it. "Though you must have written this after a thorough washing of hands," he chuckled uneasily. "Didn't want to spoil it with grime," she nodded. "Quite so. Some stains never do wash out." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple set down her knitting and opened the small notebook she kept for village peculiarities. On a new page, she wrote, "Restorative drops, valerian plus hush. Purchasers, Linton, Beatrice. Both coin, Mr. Rook, invoice clean." Beatrice, violet scent, solicitor's hand. Bottle, tidy, not clean. She hesitated, then added one more line. Cat refused kippers.
Not nerves. That night she sat by her fire,
Letting her thoughts unspool. Mrs. Linton's trembling hands. Beatrice's perfect imitation. The chemist's quiet remark. And Tiggy, who had sniffed at a sealed bottle instead of a meal because cats, after all, trust their senses more than people do. Her mind lingered on Mrs. Hartwell's pantry, where the same brown bottle had stood, its surface wiped to a shine, save for one small crescent near the cork.
a thumbprint perhaps.
The mark of haste rather than habit. Miss Marple looked into the fire, watching the coals shift.
It's never the poison that gives them away, she murmured.
It's the polishing. Outside, the night settled softly over the village, calm and unknowing. In some windows, light still glowed. In others, shadows whispered of worry. Somewhere down the lane, a cat mewed, a patient, questioning sound. Miss Marple smiled faintly, folding her hands in her lap.
A teaspoon at dusk, she said under her breath.
Yes, that would do it, if one didn't care who drank it next. And Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew she had just seen the first shadow of murder. Chapter 7. A Harvest Supper of Alibis. The harvest supper at St. Mary Mead was, as everyone said, the most cheerful event of the season, though cheerful is a word that can mean many things. Beneath the banners of paper leaves and the smell of baked apples and cider, something taut and watchful moved among the laughter. Miss Marple felt it the moment she entered the hall. It was like catching a whisper just after it's spoken, gone, but not forgotten. "Ah, Miss Marple," called Mrs. Bantry, her cheeks pink with exertion. "You'll take a place near the front. The Colonel's promised to recite something after pudding. He's been rehearsing all week." "That will be a treat," Miss Marple said kindly, though she privately thought the Colonel's voice sounded better in short bursts. She set down her knitting bag beneath the table, one never knew when waiting might present itself, and took a small plate of apple tart. Around her, villagers bustled and chatted, faces flushed, voices bright, yet the brightness struck Miss Marple as overdone, the way a room looks when too many lamps have been lit to chase away a single shadow. Across the hall, Mrs. Linton moved among the tables with her usual air of brisk hospitality, a lace scarf tied neatly at her throat. It fluttered prettily as she leaned over a tray of pies. Miss Marple noticed it immediately, the same scarf embroidered with tiny violets, though one sprig was missing from the edge. Torn away perhaps by a hedge or by haste. "Lovely scarf, isn't it?" murmured Mrs. Bantry beside her. "She says it was a gift from her late husband. A sentimental soul, our Mrs. Linton." "Sentiment," Miss Marple replied, "often hides something far more practical. A tray of cider passed, sweet and heady. The vicar's wife poured for each table, her laughter just a little too eager, as though good humour might smooth away unease. At the far end, Colonel Stukely launched into a loud anecdote about his army days. "Could spot a forgery a mile off," he boomed. "Once saw a lad try to copy the quartermaster's signature, nearly perfect, but his looped L gave him away.
Loops, my dear ladies, always betray the hand."
He roared with laughter, pleased with his own recollection. Miss Marple sipped her cider.
Loops, she thought.
Beatrice Collins had made hers smaller than her own name could justify. A small hand, a small crime, perhaps, but crimes often start like letters, with practice. "Speaking of forgeries," Mrs. Linton said brightly from behind her, setting down a steaming pie, "we must trust the vicar's ledger balances, mustn't we?" A hush, slight but definite, touched the group. Mrs. Bantry laughed uncertainly. "Oh, my dear, don't tease about such things. Mrs. Linton's eyes sparkled. Merely a joke. We're all honest folk here. Miss Marple looked at her plate and stirred her custard. She'd heard that kind of joke before, laughter used to test the air, to see who might wince. When the puddings had been served and the cider had done its work, the hall grew a little louder, a little less guarded. Voices rose in small overlapping waves. Miss Marple, content to let others talk, simply listened, her talent being not for what was said, but for how it was said. Beatrice Collins came to their table carrying a pie. "Fresh from the kitchen," she said, though her hands trembled slightly as she placed it down. The scent was rich, rosemary and something deeper, less wholesome. Mrs. Bantry inhaled.
"Heavenly."
Mrs. Linton smiled. "I do hope it suits everyone. Just a pinch of rosemary for flavour." The remark was innocent enough, but Miss Marple remembered an earlier day, a careless comment about rosemary being dreadful for some stomachs. She caught Mrs. Linton's gaze and saw the faintest flicker there, quickly gone. A new gossip wave began nearby. "Dr. Nash's assistant," whispered Mrs. Petherick, "has been keeping long hours at the dispensary."
"Someone said he's been asked to check old prescriptions. Can you imagine?"
"In St. Mary Mead, of all places." "Indeed?" Miss Marple murmured, her tone pleasant. "One might wonder what prompted that. A missing bottle or two." "Perhaps," said Mrs. Petherick. "You know how these things begin?" "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "And how they end." From the dais, the vicar clinked his glass for quiet and gave thanks for a community bound by honesty and trust. The irony was not lost on Miss Marple. Trust, she thought, was a currency some people spent more freely than others. When the speeches concluded, the vicar's wife came round with the cash box to count ticket proceeds. She opened the lid, frowned, and turned the felt lining over in her fingers.
"That's odd," she said to no one in particular. "The felt's upside down."
"It was green side up when I placed the coins in this morning." Miss Marple leaned slightly closer, her expression serene.
"Perhaps someone was tidying, my dear."
"People so often rearrange things to make them appear untouched." The woman blinked, puzzled. Yes, perhaps." From the other end of the room came more laughter, the kind that tried too hard. Colonel Stukely was in rare form, telling his forgery story for a second time, though fewer people laughed. Miss Marple glanced toward Mrs. Linton. The lace at her throat quivered slightly, though there was no draught. Nervousness, perhaps, or guilt's small chill. As the evening wore on, Miss Marple wandered to the refreshment table. She pretended to admire the pies while studying the locket at Mrs. Linton's neck. It caught the light with an innocent gleam, a gold oval, well polished, worn close to the skin. "What a charming piece," Miss Marple said.
"A family heirloom."
Mrs. Linton's hand flew to the chain instinctively, then relaxed.
"Oh, yes, of course. It belonged to a relative, may I?"
Miss Marple asked gently. For a moment Mrs. Linton hesitated. Then, with an unconvincing laugh, she unclasped the chain and passed it over. Miss Marple turned the locket in her hand. It was indeed gold and very old, the kind of piece one might pawn for a tidy sum. She pressed the catch and opened it. Inside, however, was no portrait of Mrs. Linton's late husband, as village gossip would expect. Instead, a faded photograph of a woman Miss Marple recognized at once, Mrs. Dulcie Hartwell, smiling faintly beside her sister. "Oh," Miss Marple said softly, her tone perfectly mild.
"How very touching." She closed the locket and returned it with a smile. Mrs. Linton's voice, when she spoke, was an octave higher.
"It's nothing sentimental, really. Just something I happen to keep."
"I don't even recall where it came from." "Of course," said Miss Marple.
"Memory does tend to misplace what conscience prefers to hide." For the rest of the evening, Mrs. Linton was quieter. Beatrice, however, seemed agitated, hovering near her employer, watching every movement as though afraid she might say too much. When Miss Marple approached her, Beatrice managed a shaky smile. Tired, my dear?
Oh, just...
The heat, Beatrice said quickly. Her tone wavered. Too many people. Yes, Miss Marple agreed.
Crowds can be dreadful. When one has secrets pressing on the heart. Beatrice's eyes widened.
But Miss Marple merely patted her hand and turned away, leaving the girl pale and thoughtful. The evening ended in bursts of laughter and clinking glasses. Yet, as Miss Marple stepped into the cool night air, she sensed that St. Mary Mead's harmony was fraying. Behind the lace curtains and polite smiles, truth was beginning to tremble like a candle in a draught. At her cottage door, she paused and looked up at the village windows glowing soft and warm. Some were lit late, too late, and somewhere among them, someone was watching, afraid of being found out. Miss Marple smiled, that small, kind smile that often preceded revelation.
A locket, a ledger, a lye-scented cloth, she murmured.
How much tidiness it takes to hide a single sin, the church bell marked 11. Miss Marple turned the key in her door, her mind quite awake. And Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew she had just seen the first shadow of murder. It began with a quiet remark in the wrong room. Such a comfort, Mrs. Linton said to no one in particular, standing in Mrs. Hartwell's parlour as if she owned it, to have everything in its place again. Her tone rang a shade too clear in the hushed cottage. The vicar and Mrs. Pritchard had come at Miss Marple's suggestion, and Mr. Rook, summoned for keys and latches, hovered near the doorway. Beatrice Collins stood by the mantel, small and pale, her eyes flitting to Miss Marple as though to ask permission to breathe. Miss Marple did not answer Mrs. Linton's remark. She merely loosened the blue ribbon beneath her straw hat and looked around the room with the mildness that always made people underestimate her. On the mantel lay the calendar, today's page showing Thursday, though it ought to have been Friday. Someone had been tidying memory as well as things. She touched the paper, then the ashtray, where a faint dusting had settled in a circle, wiped clockwise rather than lifted. Haste always left a direction. Shall we begin? She said, as cheerfully as if they were about to ice buns. No one moved. Then Reverend Pritchard coughed and said, "Begin, Miss Marple." "With the little things," Miss Marple replied. "They add up to larger truths so much more quickly than accusations do." Gossip provided the first thread. As it so often did, Mrs. Bantry, stationed conveniently at the open door,
Offered it like a sugar lump to a skittish horse.
"People do say, my dear Mrs. Linton, that you saw a light here at midnight the day before Mrs. Hartwell went away." "So I did," Mrs. Linton answered quickly. "A mistake, I'm sure. She was a poor sleeper." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "And yet no letters were posted. No case was packed. No parcel of wool collected. In my small experience, poor sleepers still behave like themselves." A small silence followed. Beatrice's fingers twisted in the edge of her handkerchief. The lace trembled. Mr. Rook shifted and made his bicycle bell jingle in his pocket. Mrs. Pritchard said something about draughts and latched windows, and then stopped. As if she had walked into a room and forgotten why, Miss Marple crossed to the pantry. The brown bottle stood where Miss Marple had last noticed it during the earlier search, a little farther back now, tucked behind the flower. She drew it forward gently. The glass shone as if newly polished. Near the cork lay the small crescent of unpolished glass she had admired before, the lone survivor of a hurried wiping. "Restorative drops," Miss Marple read aloud, with soft disapproval. "Valerian for sleep, and a hush that is not quite as innocent as its name." Mrs. Linton laughed. "Surely you're not suggesting—" "Oh, Miss Marple, really?" "It is such a tidy bottle," Miss Marple went on as if the other had not spoken. "Tidy things seldom mind being handled."
"This one minds. One can tell by the courtesy with which its owner tries to erase herself." Beatrice's breath caught.
She stepped forward.
I only thought Mrs. Linton said it calmed headaches." "My dear," Miss Marple said kindly, I do not think you are the one who polishes in circles. She closed the pantry door with a small click.
You merely delivered a letter in a fine copied hand. The second thread came from tone, not words. Colonel Stukely, who had wandered in late with the authority of a man who never arrives on time but always arrives loudly, declared, if there has been mischief, it was by some scoundrel with a false signature.
I can spot a forgery a mile off. How fortunate, Miss Marple returned.
Then you will recognize that the note inviting Mrs. Hartwell to a private discussion at the station, purporting to be from Simmons and Pike, was not written by any solicitor at all. It was written by someone who practiced loops and capitals on a blotter in a stationer's back room. She turned her head just enough to include Beatrice without pinning her, as someone who believed she was addressing envelopes on behalf of a lady with a pressing family matter. Beatrice's lips formed the word sorry, but did not send it into the air. Miss Marple spared her by looking away. The third thread, Miss Marple continued gently, is as humble as a cat. Tiggy turned up his nose at kippers in one kitchen and purred at a sealed bottle in another. Cats recognize what we choose to ignore. Mrs. Linton's hands, smooth and careful, came together at her waist. The lace scarf at her throat stirred, though no breeze entered the little parlour. This is quite absurd, she said, in a voice that aimed for amused and landed on brittle.
If Dulcie has gone to her sister, then your speculations are merely stories. Stories are patterns, Miss Marple said.
Knit correctly, they do not drop a stitch. She moved to the hearth. Mrs. Hartwell was made to drink something soothing that was not simple. She was then persuaded to take a short walk, a little air to settle you, dear Dulcie, out by the garden door. The inner doorknob bears the imprint of a hand returning from soil, not the lane. Is a small thing, but small things are my vocation. At this point, Mr. Rook burst out, if you're thinking I carried anything, I didn't. Tools, yes, and I was owed for them. I'm sure you were, Miss Marple agreed pleasantly, and you make useful red herrings with your crates and your complaints. But a crate that rattles like china is best pushed by a person who knows what is in it, not by a man who would peer and ask. The handyman stared, then looked almost relieved to be set aside. The fourth thread is money, Miss Marple went on quietly. Coins that never quite added up, a cash box whose felt was returned, reversed so that the smallest pieces sank out of sight, a ledger annotated in a neat, unfamiliar hand on the day it was most inconvenient to have an unfamiliar hand in it, an annuity just reassigned, a pawn ticket folded like a prayer, for a gold locket once belonging to Mrs. Hartwell's sister and now, by some miracle, around Mrs. Linton's neck. The vicar's wife drew in a breath. Mrs. Linton's hand rose involuntarily to the chain. The lace at her throat fluttered again. Miss Marple's voice softened until it sounded like knitting needles in a quiet room. You feared that small shortages would be noticed, and you desired more than your share of safety. A letter, artfully scented and convincingly addressed, suggested a discreet consultation. A teaspoon at dusk, administered with friendly care, lulled Dulcie's good sense. Then a late, quiet train that does not announce itself, how convenient that our line offers such courtesy, carried away a trunk said to contain tools. For one nervous night, the trunk lay under the lilac, 5 old stones, and 1 new to hide its rest. In the morning, a crate rattled toward the platform, and the porter was asked to hold a door. "Storytelling," Mrs. Linton cried, but her voice broke on the second syllable, and the break told more than the word.
I would never. Not the thing you imagine, Miss Marple said gently.
Not an ending by violence.
An ending by arranging.
You would not dream of striking anyone. You prefer tidying. But you would, I think, persuade and soothe and sign oh so carefully on a day convenient principally to yourself. You would help a woman who trusted you to rest and then to travel.
And then you would keep her locket safe while you balanced sums that were already unbalanced in your heart. Beatrice made a small sound.
Almost a child's. She told me it was a kindness, she whispered. She said Mrs. Hartwell wanted things quiet.
I didn't know. No, Miss Marple said, and there was no censure in it.
You knew only how to copy a hand that seemed important. You will tell the truth now, and that will be your beginning. Enough, Mrs. Linton said suddenly, very low. The energy went out of her face. The pretty animation that had always looked like warmth revealed itself as effort. She untied the lace scarf with steady fingers and set it upon the little table where a tract about charity lay face up.
If you must know, Dulcie was upset.
She had been generous with small loans and, well, unbusinesslike in their recall. She spoke of telling the vicar everything.
It would have ruined. She stopped.
It would have caused distress. I only meant to delay her, to make time to put the books quite right. The drops were gentle.
I've taken them myself.
She was only to sleep on the matter. As for the train, Mrs. Hartwell was a woman of decisions.
I thought, oh, what does it matter what I thought? Her voice frayed at the edges.
I returned the cash in full. I did. You will find the accounts balanced now. Balances can be truthful and still be late, Miss Marple said. Truth has a timetable of its own. A soft confusion filled the room. The vicar murmuring a scripture half remembered, Mrs. Pritchard dabbing her eyes, Mr. Rook swearing he had never touched a locket in his life, Beatrice weeping without tears, soundless and ashamed. Only Miss Marple stood quite still, looking at Mrs. Linton with the same kindness she might have offered a frightened child who has put the wrong ingredient into jam. There will be questions, Miss Marple said gently, from the proper people. You will answer them directly, and you will tell where the trunk was sent and what was in it. It is not too late to change the nature of this ending. Mrs. Linton closed her eyes. When she opened them, she looked finally like herself, without charm or performance. To Brackstone, she said. Left luggage under the name Dale. It held clothes and papers and, oh, take the key. The locket is hers.
I never meant. She did not finish. Outside, a cart rattled past on Rose Lane.
The village went on knitting its ordinary afternoon. Miss Marple moved to the window and lifted the latch. The faintest trace of violet met the air and disappeared. She closed the window again. Thank you.